The night inside, Aurelia held itself with the quiet smugness of a cat that had just eaten someone else's canary. Light poured from chandeliers cut from crystal sharp enough to wound, scattering over white tablecloths that were ironed flatter than excuses. The hum in the room wasn't conversation so much as an expensive drone, like bees who'd gone to finishing school. Forks chimed on porcelain that had crossed an ocean under armed guard, and the air smelled of shaved truffles and confidence, two things that tended to spoil if left unattended. Ellie slipped through that atmosphere the way a shadow moves across a wall, visible only if you cared to notice, and no one in this place ever did. Her black uniform clung to her like anonymity, her hair pinned so severely it seemed to warn off frivolity, and her shoes chose practicality over anything resembling joy. Beneath the starched collar, cool against her skin, rested a silver locket. To most, it was an accessory no fancier than a charm from a forgotten stall. To the few who knew jewelry like a second language, it whispered, Van Cleef, inheritance, history. Ellie let it whisper alone, for her job here was not to speak. The room thought of her as a pair of hands, hands that carried Pellegrino to lips stained by Bordeaux, hands that spirited away plates where only sauce ghosts remained. Those same hands had once flipped through spreadsheets at Wharton, touched the wood of her father's old desk, and steadied the wheel of a boat that never made it back to shore. The scar across her knuckle, a faint white slash earned in childhood, had more story in it than the diners around her would grant her entire life. Her real name was Arrogance. To the newspapers, to investment portfolios, to the financial whisperers of Manhattan, she was a wealthy recluse. To herself, she was a woman living inside an experiment, trading penthouse glass for kitchen grease, trading family legacy for the ordinary wear of service. The city, she decided, was easier to understand from ground level, where sweat pooled in shoes and cruelty hid behind laughter. Tonight, she watched Table 7, the booth curved like a throne. Julian Sterling sat there with the polish of a man born under a better star, his tie knotted with precision, his smile practiced as a politician's handshake. He carried an aura of charm that nearly worked, yet his eyes betrayed him with flickers of fatigue, like a stage actor tired of his own lines. Opposite him sprawled Tiffany Davenport, whose beauty was sharpened until it could cut the person standing too close. She gestured as if commanding troops, bracelets jangling like warning bells, her laugh piercing the carefully cultivated hush. "Julian, darling," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough to slice through the murmurs. "Are you listening?" Beatrice is using a caterer with no finesse. Imagine, buffet style at the Hamptons. Tragic. Julian smiled thinly, jaw twitching as his gaze skimmed the room. "Yes, Tiff. Tragic." I heard his words lined up properly, but his attention was wandering somewhere else entirely. Ellie approached, steady, carrying a bottle that cost more than her rent. The label, Chateau Margaux, 1998, spoke in a French accent of money, patience, and vines rooted deeper than most marriages. The glass was cold in her hand. The candlelight played in its dark depths like secrets unwilling to surface. Tiffany's eyes found her. They flicked up and down with the precision of a jeweler examining a counterfeit diamond. Uniform. Shoes. Hands. A smirk blossomed. Thin. Cruel. Practiced. She leaned toward Julian, letting her disdain become performance. "Honestly, Julian, look at her. Do you really think she knows vintage from thrift? She probably thinks terroir is a salad." Ellie held her face still, letting the insult pass over her like wind over stone. She placed the bottle gently on the linen, posture precise. "Mr. Sterling, Miss Davenport, your wine." Julian gave a small nod. "Thank you, Ellie." Relief softened his tone, though it did nothing to soften the moment. But Tiffany wasn't finished. She placed her manicured hand on the table, nails glinting under chandelier light. "Let me see your hands," she said. For a beat, even the restaurant hushed. Ellie blinked once, then obeyed. She lifted her hands into the glow. They were clean, nails trimmed practical, the faint scar visible if you searched. They were workers' hands, strong hands, honest hands. Tiffany inhaled sharply. Scars, unkempt cuticles. At this level, presentation is everything. Her words carried like darts thrown at a board, each syllable meant to sting. Julian shifted in his seat, uncomfortable. "Tiff." Ellie felt heat coil under her skin but forced it still. She had practiced the art of invisibility for 6 months, perfecting the neutral mask that endured everything and revealed nothing. "My apologies, Miss Davenport." "Shall I pour?" "Yes, do try not to spill." Tiffany leaned back, voice loud enough for the next table to savor. "This bottle is worth more than her apartment." Ellie steadied the neck, tilted it with care. The wine poured smooth into crystal, releasing aromas of cedar and black currant that wrapped around the table like velvet. She focused on the stream, on the liquid's curve, on the ritual. And then Tiffany moved. Just a flick of her heel under the table, subtle enough to pass for accident. The service stand wobbled. The bottle jerked. A crimson arc leapt free, splashing across Tiffany's immaculate white silk blouse. The restaurant gasped in unison. Tiffany sprang to her feet, shrieking, "You clumsy idiot! This is Valentino, custom made." The manager, Mr. Dubois, rushed forward, his face crumpled into worry. Julian leapt up as well, blotting uselessly at Tiffany's blouse with a napkin that spread the stain wider. Ellie placed the bottle back on its stand, her hand steady though, her pulse thundered. "I am very sorry," she said evenly, though she had felt the deliberate kick. "Sorry?" Tiffany's voice rang through the restaurant. "Do you know what this costs? Do you know who I am? You'll pay for every cent, or you'll never work in this city again. Fire her, Mr. Dubois, right now." In front of everyone, the demand sliced the room open. Diners turned their heads. Forks froze midair. This wasn't about silk anymore. It was spectacle. Ellie raised her eyes to Tiffany's face. Her voice, calm, cut through the tension. "It was an accident." "Of course it was," Tiffany sneered, lips curling. "Just as it was an accident you were born to serve." "Mediocrity is destiny," dear Julian touched Tiffany's arm, murmuring, "Enough." But his grip lacked conviction. He wanted peace, not justice. His inaction rang louder than Tiffany's cruelty. Ellie drew back her hands, spine straight. "Shall I continue, sir?" she asked, her voice a mask of courtesy. "Yes, just finish," Tiffany snapped, her smirk returning. "Try not to ruin anything else," Ellie poured. The ruby liquid filled the decanter, perfumed the air. Around them, whispers swelled like a tide. The performance was complete. The girlfriend triumphant, the waitress humiliated, the boyfriend silent. Julian settled the bill quickly, dropping his black Amex card with all the haste of a man fleeing a crime scene. He gave Ellie one last glance, pity in his eyes, as useless as the napkin in his hand. Tiffany leaned down, her perfume sharp as poison. "Don't think this is over," she hissed. "You'll never step foot in a decent place again. Know your place." They swept out, leaving behind the echo of judgment. Mr. Dubois placed a trembling hand on Ellie's shoulder. "Take a break, please." His sympathy was weak, his fear stronger. Ellie nodded once, retreating to the alley behind the restaurant. The night air was thick with fried garlic and champagne gone stale. Brick walls pressed close, graffiti shouting color where life had gone gray. She leaned against the stone, finally letting the mask slip. A single tear broke free, burning as it slid down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, furious at herself for even that much. It wasn't the blouse or the wine or the threat to her job that had pierced her. It was the contempt, the unvarnished belief that worth could be measured in labels, in polish, in who bowed and who demanded bows. And it was Julian's silence, heavy as lead, that sealed the wound. Her phone buzzed. The screen glowed with a name older than her grief. Arthur Kensington. She answered, voice taut. "Arthur." "Are you all right?" His voice came warm, steady, the kind of voice that could smooth the edge off panic. He had known her since she was a child, climbing trees, taller than sense, had stood by her father through storms, both financial and personal. "I've had better nights," she admitted, summoning a taxi with a raised hand as she walked out of the alley. The street roared with horns and neon, the city's heartbeat raw compared to the suffocating quiet of Aurelia. "Tell me," Arthur urged. So she did, every humiliating detail, from the inspection of her hands to the deliberate kick of Tiffany's heel. She left nothing unsaid. Arthur's silence was colder than words. When he finally spoke, his voice carried steel. "That woman is a vulture in couture, and Julian Sterling, Robert, would be ashamed." He just stood there. "Yes, he let it happen. Inaction is action," Arthur said grimly. "And tomorrow at 9 a.m., we'll see just what action you're ready for." The wolves are circling Sterling Innovations. It's time to come home. The cab carried her north through Manhattan's midnight veins, headlights slicing across wet asphalt, horns punctuating sentences no one really finished. Rain had been here earlier, and the air smelled of diesel and something sour, like bread gone wrong. Ara, though the world in Aurelia knew her as Ellie, sat rigid in the back seat, watching the city through glass streaked with neon reflections. She had slipped into this experiment willingly, choosing sweat and ridicule over privilege and silence. But tonight had stripped her to something raw. The sneers still echoed in her ears, Tiffany's voice sharp as broken glass. Mediocrity is destiny. Her fists rested on her lap, nails digging crescent moons into her palms. She remembered her mother's laugh on the sailboat that final summer, the one swallowed by an ocean that gave back nothing but wreckage. She remembered her father's eyes when he talked about encryption as though math could be holy. And she remembered standing at their funeral, drowning in condolences while lawyers spoke of inheritance as if it were another name for loneliness. Since then, she had been two women, Ara Vance, heiress behind glass, and Ellie, waitress without a future. Tonight, the walls between them cracked. The cab turned onto Central Park West, tires humming over seams in the pavement. The building rose from the street like certainty, its facade of steel and glass reflecting the lights of a city that never apologized. She paid the driver, cash, habit, and stepped out. The doorman greeted her with practiced warmth, though surprise flickered in his eyes. Miss Vance seldom used this entrance anymore. The private elevator carried her upward, its hum steady, its mirrors doubling her, until she felt surrounded by women she half recognized. When the doors parted, The penthouse greeted her with silence. Floor-to-ceiling windows opened onto the skyline, where skyscrapers jostled for space like men at a bar too crowded for manners. The interior was minimalist. Marble floors that echoed, leather couches that looked sat on once a year, bookshelves where even the dust seemed curated. Her parents had chosen this design. Clean lines, no clutter, everything speaking of control. It had once felt cold to her. Tonight it felt like armor. Arthur Kensington stood in the study, a glass of Macallan 25 glinting amber in his hand, files stacked on the marble table beside him. He had the presence of an old oak tree, rooted, weathered, unshakable. His suit, Savile Row sharp, carried the faint scent of tobacco and rain. He lifted his glass in greeting. "Welcome home, Era." Or perhaps I should say, welcome back. She let herself fall into a leather chair, exhaustion tugging at her shoulders. The night's humiliation still clung like smoke. "She wanted me fired," she said flatly, "for being clumsy." Arthur set the glass down, slid a file across the table. His eyes, sharp beneath silver brows, carried both anger and pride. "Tomorrow you'll show them what clumsy really looks like. This isn't about revenge on some gaudy parasite. It's bigger. The company's bleeding, and the sharks smell it. Shaw is making his move." She opened the file. Paper rustled like dry leaves, charts and graphs staring back with cold precision. Shareholdings, acquisition trails, names of board members, each line another step in a dance choreographed to end in collapse. She scanned the pages, her mind switching gears from waitress to strategist with the ease of muscle memory. The waitress had poured wine. Era Vance dissected balance sheets. "Harrison Shaw," Arthur said, voice heavy with contempt. "Corporate raider, old school. He's been buying through shells, gathering nearly 18%. He has a mole on the board feeding him information. He plans to gut R&D, sell the patents, and leave Sterling Innovations a carcass. Your father's work, ashes in his ledger." Ara's lips tightened. She saw her father in memory, explaining code to her at the dinner table, sketching diagrams on napkins. Innovation had been his heartbeat. To imagine it carved up and sold off like spare parts made her blood run hot. She flipped a page, noting projections, buyouts, proxy battles. "And what's stopping him?" she asked quietly, though the answer sat in her chest. Arthur leaned forward. "You. EV Capital controls 15%. With your stake, plus the 8% held by loyalists to Robert's vision, we can form a bloc strong enough to stop him. Shaw thinks EV is faceless. A hedge fund in the fog. He doesn't know it's you." "Not yet," Ara rose, walking to the window. Below, the city stretched like a circuit board lit in pulses of yellow and red. Somewhere out there, Julian Sterling was likely pouring apologies into Tiffany over champagne, promising her new blouses and better nights. They thought in silk and spectacle. They hadn't learned the first thing about consequence. "Prepare the Tom Ford suit," she said, her reflection in the glass, looking older, sharper than she remembered. "Navy, the one that speaks louder than words. I want the Manolos that click like hammers, and schedule a briefing with the proxy. Team before sunrise. If we're going to war, I want every weapon sharpened." Arthur allowed himself a smile, thin and satisfied. "Yes, Era." Her gaze stayed fixed on the skyline. Tiffany Davenport had tried to teach her about knowing her place. Julian Sterling had failed to defend even the smallest dignity. Tomorrow morning, she would walk into their boardroom not as a ghost, not as a waitress, but as the daughter of Robert Vance, armed with silence, turned into steel. The morning didn't so much dawn as it stumbled out of bed, bleary-eyed, dragging clouds across Manhattan's skyline like wrinkled sheets. The city yawned awake with its usual cacophony. Delivery trucks grumbling at curbs, subway brakes screaming underground, jackhammers auditioning for percussion roles on Broadway. People rushed with paper cups steaming in their hands, faces set like clocks already behind. Against this backdrop of ordinary chaos, one man paced the length of his apartment with the unease of a condemned defendant rehearsing his plea. Julian Sterling had not slept. His bed, king-sized and draped in Egyptian cotton, felt more like an interrogation chair. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. Not Tiffany's sculpted, sneering mask, but the quiet dignity of the waitress with scarred hands. Ellie. No, not Ellie. The name carried weight he couldn't reconcile. The image of her calm composure while Tiffany tore her apart had branded itself on his conscience. And the worst of it, the part that gnawed him raw, wasn't Tiffany's cruelty. It was his own silence. He had built his career on performing strength, cultivating the image of a man who could steer storms. But last night, in a restaurant perfumed with money, he had been smaller than a whisper. He had chosen the easy path, the path of inaction, and it stank worse than failure. Tiffany's voice had drilled into him, mediocrity is destiny, but it wasn't Ellie she had condemned. It was him. Now the morning pressed him forward toward a different kind of stage, Sterling Innovation's Boardroom. His father had once ruled it like a monarch, his voice enough to steady markets. Julian had inherited that throne, but his reign felt flimsy, all guilt and no steel, and the wolves had scented weakness. Harrison Shaw circled, gathering proxies, his eyes on the jugular. Sterling's patents, Robert Vance's genius, the crown jewels of cybersecurity. Julian's job wasn't just on the line. The company itself teetered, and his father's legacy threatened to collapse in his hands. He showered long, hoping the scalding water could wash off cowardice. It couldn't. He dressed carefully in a charcoal suit, knotting his tie with fingers that trembled when memory replayed Tiffany's staged shriek in the splash of red wine across silk. The mirror reflected a man polished but hollow, jaw tight, eyes haunted. He straightened his shoulders, practiced a smile, and failed at both. Outside, the Rolls waited, its paint black as confession, its chrome gleaming under the gray sky. The driver tipped his cap. Julian slid into the back seat, leather swallowing him whole. Manhattan blurred past. The huddled hot dog stands, the neon promising sins at discount, the steam rising from manholes like exhausted ghosts. He envied the cab drivers swearing at traffic, the bike messengers darting between buses. Their lives, for all their danger, seemed honest. The car pulled up before Sterling Tower, a glass and steel monolith, thrusting 40 stories upward like ambition with a mortgage. The building's mirrored facade reflected clouds heavy with threat, and Julian caught his own image distorted, multiplied. Too many Julians, all of them uncertain. He stepped out, adjusting his tie as if strangulation could be disguised as style. The lobby was a cathedral to capitalism. Marble floors gleaming, chandeliers shaped like galaxies, security guards in suits too tight for comfort. Elevators waited in a row, their chrome doors reflecting anxious faces. Julian entered one with David Chen, his COO, who wore worry like a second suit. "They're all here already," David murmured. His voice was pitched low, for the elevator had ears. Every reflective surface in this building seemed to. Thorne, Davies, The usual suspects and rumors. Shaw's proxies are in play. Julian swallowed. And EV? David shook his head. Silent as a tomb. 15%, still faceless. All we know is Kensington manages it. If they don't show, Shaw could tip the scale. Kensington. The name nagged him. He remembered hearing it at his father's side years ago, back when business was taught over bourbon and not quarterly reports. But he couldn't place it fully, and the elevator was already dinging open, spitting them out onto the 40th floor. The boardroom was already half full. The space was cavernous, lined with windows that turned the city into a glittering witness. A mahogany table stretched like a runway, polished so smooth it reflected faces as if daring them to see themselves. Leather chairs encircled it, each occupied by men who carried fortunes in their wrinkles and disdain in their cufflinks. Marcus Thorne, chairman, sat at the head, his hair white as ledger paper, his expression carved from granite. He tapped a gold pen against the table, a sound like distant thunder. To his right lounged Richard Davies, ruddy-faced, his tie loosened already, eyes sharp with suspicion. Others clustered along the sides, bankers, lawyers, venture men whose smiles were knives sheathed in etiquette. The air buzzed with low murmurs, punctuated by the hiss of the espresso machine in the adjoining lounge. Silver trays clinked as assistants set down pastries no one would eat. Outside the windows, clouds pressed lower, darkening the skyline. And in the corner, like a spectator at an execution, sat Tiffany Davenport. She had insisted on coming, calling it moral support for Julian, though her real motive was obvious: to be seen, to bask in reflected power, to strut among titans as though she belonged. She crossed her legs with dramatic precision, her dress the color of blood, her bracelets flashing like shackles disguised as trophies. She surveyed the room with the same disdain she reserved for waitstaff, utterly confident she was the only woman of consequence present. Julian avoided her gaze. Shame still clung like smoke. He busied himself greeting board members, shaking hands that gripped too firmly, promising alliances he doubted he had. He could feel eyes measuring him, weighing his worth like cattle at market. The chair at the head belonged to him, but it felt colder than the marble floor. The meeting had not yet begun when the doors opened. Heads turned. Silence rippled like a shiver through the room. Arthur Kensington entered first, composed, his silver hair gleaming under the recessed lights, his suit carrying the easy weight of bespoke authority. He moved with the calm stride of a man who knew secrets and wielded them like blades. Behind him came a woman who altered the air itself. Her heels struck the marble with sharp clicks, each one an announcement. She wore navy Tom Ford tailored to perfection, her dark hair falling in sleek waves, her presence radiating calm command. It was Ellie. And yet not Ellie. The waitress's deferential mask had vanished, replaced by a composure that filled the room. Julian's breath caught. His mind scrambled, clashing images. The woman pouring wine with scarred hands, and this vision of authority striding into his boardroom. He told himself it had to be coincidence, a sister, a cousin, but his gut knew. Tiffany let out a laugh, brittle and echoing, loud enough to command attention. Goodness, Julian. They'll let anyone in, won't they? Even the catering staff. Her words, sharp as icicles, rang across the polished table. But no one laughed with her. All eyes were fixed on the woman walking to the table's center, Arthur at her side. Her gaze moved deliberately, assessing each man, measuring them as though their worth could be tallied in the tilt of their shoulders. When her eyes found Julian's, there was no anger, no warmth, only cool assessment. He felt stripped bare. Arthur stopped, placed a hand gently on her arm, and spoke in a voice that carried authority, wrapped in velvet. "Gentlemen, forgive the interruption. Allow me to introduce the principal of EV Capital, holder of a 15% stake in Sterling Innovations, the deciding voice in today's matters, Miss Ara Vance." The name dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Silence followed, spreading outward. Forks stilled, pens stopped scratching, throats closed around words that would not come. Ara Vance, the daughter of Robert and Catherine, the heiress hidden since tragedy, rumored to live abroad, dismissed as a recluse. And here she was, not tucked away in some chateau, but seated across from them, a power radiating not from her fortune, but from her presence. Julian felt his stomach drop. The waitress he had pitied. The woman Tiffany had mocked. The scarred hands Tiffany had ridiculed. She was the ghost in the ledgers. The shareholder they had courted in absentia, the hidden player holding their fate. He had underestimated her in every way possible. Tiffany's face drained of color. Her smirk wilted into disbelief. Her lips moved soundless, as if searching for a language that no longer existed. The woman she had humiliated was not just someone. She was the someone, the one who had more wealth, more power, more claim to this company's soul than anyone else in the room. Ara lowered herself into the leather chair beside Arthur, her posture regal, her expression unreadable. She folded her hands on the polished wood, the scar on her knuckle catching the light like a reminder. Marcus Thorne cleared his throat, fumbling for words. "Ms. Vance, this is an unexpected honor. We were unaware you took an active role in the company's affairs." Her voice, when it came, was calm and level, yet carried steel beneath it. "My interest has always been active, Mr. Thorne. Until now, it has been silent. But silence," she paused, letting the word breathe, "has limits." Her gaze flicked briefly to Julian, a subtle strike that left his chest tight. The boardroom held its breath. Ara Vance had revealed herself. The game had changed. The silence that followed Ara's words had the weight of marble slabs lowering into place. Even the air conditioning's low hum seemed to falter, as if the machines themselves were holding their breath. Outside, storm clouds massed over Manhattan, pressing their gray bellies against the skyline. The city seemed to sense that something in this room, 40th floor, mahogany table, leather chairs, was about to tilt the balance of more than one fortune. Julian Sterling sat rigid, pulse hammering in his ears. He kept his hands folded on the polished wood so no one could see the tremor there. Ara's reveal had left him gutted. The waitress with scarred hands was Ara Vance, the hidden heir, the silent weight behind EV Capital's 15%. He felt as though he'd been wandering blind through his own life, mistaking shadows for substance. He could still see her face across candlelight last night, enduring Tiffany's cruelty with more grace than he had ever managed in a boardroom. And now she sat here, calm as iron, staring down a table of titans. Before Marcus Thorne could gather his dignity into another sentence, the doors swung open again. The interruption carried a different electricity, less revelation, more invasion. Harrison Shaw entered, flanked by lawyers in suits so sharp they could cut wire. Shaw wore his confidence like cologne, thick and choking, his grin wide enough to qualify as vandalism. He set down a heavy briefcase with the deliberate thud of a man tossing a gauntlet. "Hope I'm not late," Shaw said, surveying the room with predator's ease. Wouldn't want to miss the fireworks. Marcus rose half from his chair, his jaw locked. This is a closed meeting, Shaw. Shaw waved the words away with lazy arrogance. Closed. Open. It hardly matters when I hold close to 20%. With the proxies I've secured, I have every right to propose a new direction. A profitable one. His eyes gleamed as they slid across the room, finally resting on Ara with something between amusement and challenge. Ara did not look up from the papers in front of her. She turned a page slowly, as though reviewing a grocery list. Mr. Shaw is known for stripping companies like copper wire. He prefers to call it maximizing shareholder value. I call it grave robbing. Her voice was calm even, but the edge in it sliced through Shaw's grin. Shaw chuckled, though the sound lacked conviction. Bold words for someone fresh to the table. Finally, she lifted her eyes. They were cool, unflinching, the kind of gaze that made men shift in their seats. Bold, number, accurate, and you'll find accuracy more dangerous than bravado. The words landed like hammer blows. Several board members glanced at each other, uneasy. Julian felt both shame and awe stir inside him. Shame for his weakness, awe for her precision. Shaw cleared his throat. Gentlemen, ladies, let's not waste time. Sterling Innovations has become complacent, bloated. I propose a restructuring. Trim the fat, sell off non-essential assets, return immediate dividends to shareholders. He laid papers across the table, charts bristling with projections. The lawyers flanked him like vultures ready to feed. Ara tapped her finger lightly against her own file. How curious, she murmured. Your plan depends on cutting the very heart of this company. Its research and development. My father's work. Robert Vance's legacy. Without R&D, Sterling is a hollow brand, a shell. That is what you would sell, a corpse in designer clothing. Her words rang out, and Julian saw several board members stiffen. Even Richard Davies, ruddy and sharp, avoided her eyes. She leaned forward, placing her own papers in the center. I have spent 6 months conducting due diligence, not from a villa in France, from the ground level of this city. I listened to employees. I observed customers, and I saw truths you've ignored. Her tone sharpened. Our engineers are leaving for competitors. Projects are delayed because leadership prioritizes quarterly optics over long-term stability. We've allowed marketing to consume funds that should have gone to innovation. And that, gentlemen, is why Shaw thought this company ripe for slaughter. Every sentence fell like a stone in a pond, ripples of recognition spreading across the table. One board member, a thin man with spectacles, bristled. These are baseless accusations? Ara cut him off, voice still smooth. Are they? Then explain Project Atlas. 18 months behind schedule, with 3 senior engineers gone to Tesla security. Explain the revolving door in the Data Integrity Division. Explain the 30% increase in consumer returns for our flagship product. These are not rumors. These are facts. Her words stripped away pretense like wind tearing shingles off a roof. The room sank into silence again. Julian sat stunned. He had known pieces of this, of course. He had dismissed them as the natural messiness of business. But hearing them laid bare, named with surgical clarity, it was unbearable. He wanted to shrink, to vanish under the table. Yet a part of him felt something else too. Relief. Finally, someone was saying aloud what he had avoided admitting to himself. Ara turned her gaze back to Shaw. So no, Mr. Shaw. You will not feast on this company. Not while I hold 15%. Not while those loyal to my father hold another 8%. That is 23%. Enough to block you. Shaw's grin finally cracked. His fingers tightened on the edge of the table. This isn't over. It is, Ara replied simply. Shaw slammed his papers into his briefcase, muttered something venomous, and stormed out with his lawyers trailing behind like hyenas denied a carcass. The door closed, and the boardroom exhaled. But Ara was not finished. She drew another file from her folder and slid it to the center of the table. Before we congratulate ourselves, there is rot here. Shaw knew too much. His intelligence was precise. That means someone in this room has been feeding him. A ripple of unease spread. Men shifted in their chairs, glanced at each other, cleared throats. Suspicion turned the air thick. Ara's gaze moved deliberately, one face to another, until it rested on Richard Davies. Her voice softened, though it carried more weight than thunder. Mr. Davies, you received transfers to a Cayman account, $2 million yesterday, traced from a shell owned by Shaw's son-in-law. The room froze. Davies' face reddened, then blanched. Outrageous! I have given my life to this company. His words sputtered into silence when Ara slid a single sheet across the table, a bank statement. His eyes devoured it, then faltered. His bluster collapsed. You were my father's friend, Ara said. For the first time her voice cracked, pain threading through iron. You carried his coffin, and you betrayed him. Security entered quietly, summoned by Arthur with a flick of his wrist. Davies rose, shaking, sputtering, but the fight had drained out of him. 2 guards guided him from the room. The door shut behind him like a gavel. The board sat stunned, the betrayal raw, the evidence undeniable. Ara let the silence linger, pressing it down on them until it branded their memory. Then she spoke again, her voice steady once more. I propose a motion. Immediate reinvestment of 25% of profits into core R&D. We must rebuild from the inside. Innovation is not a luxury. It is survival. My father used to say, build a decade ahead and you'll own the present. We have been renting the present for too long. Marcus Thorne frowned, pen tapping nervously. 25% is aggressive. Dividends will suffer. Ara's eyes sharpened. This company was not built on dividends. It was built on genius, on work done in quiet labs, not glossy ads. Do you want to appease shareholders today? Or do you want this company alive tomorrow? The room shifted. Richard Davies' empty chair stood as silent testimony. Finally, Marcus nodded slowly. She's right. Another board member raised a hand. I second the motion. The vote carried. It was not unanimous, but it was decisive. Sterling innovations had been pulled back from the cliff, not by Julian, not by Thorne, but by Ara Vance, who had revealed herself not just as shareholder, but as leader. Julian sat motionless, watching. Relief washed through him, but it was tangled with humiliation. He had been the company's figurehead, yet it was Ara who had saved it. He had been a manager, performing strength. She was a leader, embodying it. In the corner, Tiffany sat stricken, her face pale as unpainted porcelain. She had thought herself the grand accessory of power, the ornament on Julian's arm. Now she looked small, irrelevant, her Cartier bracelets flashing nervously in the light. As the meeting adjourned, board members filed out, voices hushed, eyes darting to Ara with new respect. Soon the vast room was empty, but for 3 people, Ara, Julian, and Tiffany. Tiffany stood, crossing the room with a trembling smile. Julian, darling, she purred, her voice unsteady. Isn't she marvelous? We should celebrate. Invite her, Era raised one eyebrow, a look of disdain so sharp it cut Tiffany mid-sentence. Julian turned, his voice quiet but firm. "Tiffany, we're done." She blinked, disbelief shattering into panic. "Julian, go!" His tone left no room. Her composure cracked. She snatched her purse, her heels clicking unevenly as she fled. The door closed behind her, leaving only the two of them. Julian turned to Ara. His chest felt hollow, words heavy. "Miss Vance, I don't know what to say." "Then say nothing," she replied. But he stepped closer, voice trembling with sincerity. "No, I have to. Last night, I failed. I was supposed to stand against cruelty, and I didn't. Not just as CEO, as a man. I am sorry, deeply. Not because of who you are, but because I allowed it to happen at all." Era studied him, eyes searching. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, thick as fog. Then she said, "Apologies are words. Actions matter more. This company is broken. You and I have work to do." She had used "we." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was an opening. Julian felt shame burn through him, and hope spark, quietly, beside it. The boardroom's echoes had not yet died when Ara Vance stepped into her new reality. The air still carried the ghost of raised voices, the sharp tang of betrayal, the faint musk of too much cologne mixed with stale pastries nobody touched. Even the sunlight streaming through the glass walls seemed harsher, as though the city itself were taking note of what had just occurred 40 floors above the streets. Era had walked in a ghost and walked out the most powerful voice in the room. Yet power, she knew, was like a violin string. Use it with care and it sings. Tighten it too far and it snaps. Julian Sterling remained behind for a few beats longer, sinking into the heavy leather of his chair as if it might swallow him whole. He kept his eyes on the table, on the reflection of his face warped by the polish, and thought about how quickly a man could lose his place in his own story. He felt stripped of his costume, his charm, his polish, his carefully manicured image. All of it had cracked like cheap porcelain when Ara Vance revealed herself. And the worst part wasn't that the board had shifted allegiance. It was that he knew they were right to. The elevator ride down was silent, except for the faint hum of machinery. Ara stood with Arthur Kensington at her side, calm as a stone in a stream, while Julian hovered behind, feeling smaller with every descending floor. The mirrored walls doubled and redoubled their images until Julian felt surrounded by versions of himself, some angry, some ashamed, all useless. Era, by contrast, appeared only more focused, as if gravity itself had no effect on her. When the doors parted onto the marble lobby, employees turned their heads. Receptionists paused mid-call, security guards straightened instinctively, and junior analysts pretended to shuffle papers while sneaking glances. Whispers spread like brush fire. "That's her. Vance's daughter. EV Capital's ghost." Era walked forward without hurry, her heels clicking a rhythm that set the tone for the day, for the week, maybe for the decade. She didn't acknowledge the stares. Power never needed to announce itself. It simply occupied space until the air adjusted. Julian followed, acutely aware of how differently eyes moved across her and him. Once the weight of those stares had belonged to him. Now he felt like a man trailing behind his own shadow. By the time Ara reached the curb, a sleek black car waited, courtesy of Arthur. She slid inside without breaking stride. Julian, left behind for a moment, muttered a farewell and retreated to his own office upstairs, though the word retreat fit him far better than he liked. His office, glass walls, skyline stretching out like an empire, felt colder than usual. The mahogany desk gleamed with polish, but he saw only a reflection of a man hollowed out. He loosened his tie, tossed it aside, and sat in silence that pressed against him like judgment. From this very chair, he had once thought himself the embodiment of sterling innovations. Today, he realized he was little more than its caretaker, and not a very good one. Meanwhile, Ara's car carried her not to the penthouse nor to a celebratory lunch, but to the belly of the company, the R and D floors. The driver opened her door and she stepped out into a corridor that smelled of burnt coffee, solar, and the faint tang of sweat from people who lived more with prototypes than sunlight. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, buzzing faintly like impatient wasps. Here, cubicles gave way to cluttered benches, and whiteboards bore the scribbled remains of problems wrestled with at 3 a.m. The engineers weren't expecting her. They looked up in the startled silence, blinking through tired eyes behind smudged glasses. Most had never seen a board member set foot in their space unless it was to demand progress or reprimand delays. Ara broke the pattern at once. She walked to the nearest bench where a young man with a shock of unruly hair and an oil stain across his shirt pocket was hunched over a circuit board. Without asking permission, she picked it up, turned it over in her hands, and said, "Tell me what it's supposed to do." The young man blinked as though he'd been caught cheating on a test. Biometric encryption. Cuts ID verification time by about half. Still rough, though Ara studied the board with the care of someone appraising jewelry. "And what's stopping you?" He shifted, embarrassed. "Funding. We were told to shelve it until marketing signs off on consumer interest." Ara set the board down gently, like it mattered. Then she looked him straight in the eye. "Consider it unshelved." The words landed heavier than any decree from the 42nd floor ever had. Around the room, heads lifted from screens, eyes widened, and an unspoken current rippled. They weren't used to being heard, much less obeyed. For the next 2 hours, Ara walked the lab like a detective at a crime scene, asking pointed questions, listening closely, cutting through excuses. She made notes on a tablet Arthur had given her, but spent more time making eye contact than typing. She asked about bottlenecks, about frustrations, about ideas that had been dismissed. She nodded when a programmer explained latency issues, frowned at the mention of outdated servers, and promised resources, not vague resources, specifics. "I'll authorize the order myself. You'll have the funds this week. Restart the trial. I want results, not dust." Julian eventually found her there. He lingered in the doorway, watching as his employees, leaned toward her, voices animated, eyes bright in ways he hadn't seen in years. He noticed the difference immediately. When he entered these labs, conversations quieted, posture stiffened, as though everyone braced for inspection. But around Ara, the energy was different. Alive, urgent, hopeful. When Ara finally turned and noticed him, she didn't pause her conversation. She listened to the last detail from a junior engineer, nodded, and only then addressed Julian. "You should walk these floors more often," she said. It wasn't criticism, though it cut like one. It was simply truth laid bare. Julian adjusted his cuffs, searching for dignity. "I've relied too heavily on reports." Ara's mouth curved slightly, not a smile, but something more dangerous. "Reports don't leave for competitors. People do." He had no answer. He only nodded, chastened, while the engineers looked on with curiosity. It was clear who commanded the room. The rest of the afternoon unfolded in the same rhythm. Ara toured departments Julian hadn't visited in months. She stopped in customer support, where headsets crackled and screens blinked with complaint tickets. She asked one weary agent to walk her through a call and listened, really listened, while the agent explained the frustrations customers voiced about buggy updates. Ara scribbled notes, promised follow-up, and thanked her by name. The agent looked stunned, as if no one had ever noticed her existence beyond the metrics on a quarterly slide. From there, Ara moved to data analytics, finance, even janitorial staff. She asked about their routines, their pain points, their ideas. By the end of the day, word had spread across 39 floors. The Vance girl is here, and she isn't just a ghost with a trust fund. Julian shadowed her quietly, absorbing the change. Each step was a reminder of his failures, not just in strategy, but in humanity. He had hidden behind spreadsheets, charmed investors with rehearsed wit, and treated employees as numbers in a ledger. Ara treated them as the marrow of the company. He felt smaller with every department she entered, but he also felt something else, a faint stirring of relief. Maybe it wasn't too late to learn. By evening, Sterling Innovations hummed differently. Conversations in hallways carried a sharper tone, not of fear, but of cautious optimism. The smell of burnt coffee and overworked air vents hadn't changed, but the atmosphere had. A single day of Ara's presence had cracked a window in a long-stifled house. When night finally wrapped itself around the glass tower, most employees trickled out, their shoes clattering on marble floors, their voices fading into elevators. Julian returned to his office, drained but restless. He sat at his desk, city lights sprawling beneath him, and replayed the images of the day. Ara in the labs, Ara in customer support, Ara bending down to pick up a dropped folder for an intern without hesitation. Leadership wasn't polish, it was presence. He had been a manager of images. She was becoming a leader of people. He poured himself a glass of scotch and stared out the window, the amber liquid trembling slightly in his unsteady hand. Below, taxis honked, sirens wailed, neon flickered, and the city kept its relentless rhythm. Somewhere in that sprawl, Tiffany was probably nursing her wounded pride, plotting her next move, or drowning in champagne. Julian felt no urge to call her. For the first time, he saw clearly that her world was built of mirrors, and he had been fool enough to mistake reflections for reality. Ara, meanwhile, returned to her penthouse with Arthur. She stood before the wall of glass that revealed Manhattan's glittering spine, arms crossed, eyes reflecting the lights. She thought of her parents, her mother's laugh, her father's late-night diagrams, their insistence that innovation mattered more than image. Tonight, she felt closer to them than she had in years. The experiment of anonymity was over. The era of presence had begun. Arthur poured 2 glasses of wine, handing her one with a look of quiet pride. "You've woken them," he said simply. Ara swirled the glass, watching the ruby liquid catch the light. "Not enough. Tomorrow we start rebuilding." By morning the building seemed different. Though the marble hadn't changed, and the glass tower rose just as it always had above the streets below. The shift was not in the stone or steel, but in the people who poured through the revolving doors with their ID badges flashing and their paper cups steaming. Whispers ran ahead of Ara Vance like a herald's trumpet. Words spread in elevators, in hallways, in the lines for bitter lobby coffee. She was here yesterday. She talked to us. She remembered names, She unshelved projects. Employees who had learned to keep their heads down now walked a little straighter. Engineers who had been halfway out the door took another look at the prototypes on their benches. Something like pride began to stir where resignation had long lived. The era effect, though no one dared call it that aloud yet, moved invisibly from cubicle to cubicle, from lab to lab, the way the smell of rain drifts through an open window. Julian Sterling felt it too. He arrived early, before the elevators grew crowded, before the lobby hummed with speculation. His reflection in the brass doors was still the same man. Tall, handsome, wrapped in a suit worth more than most salaries. But he carried himself differently now. Humility sat on his shoulders like a new coat, unfamiliar but necessary. He had spent years believing leadership meant performance, that if he smiled just right, if he pressed flesh at galas, if he spun quarterly losses into lyrical euphemisms, he was doing his job. Now, after one day shadowing Ara through the guts of his own company, he realized he had been mistaking theater for substance. He took the elevator not to his office, but to the 20th floor, where customer support worked in headset cubicles that buzzed like a beehive. The agents looked up in shock when he stepped off. No CEO had visited them in years, except to deliver pep talks crafted by marketing. Julian didn't give a speech. He walked to a desk where a young woman with tired eyes and chipped nail polish was, in mid-call, mouthed, "May I?" and gestured to the empty chair beside her. She nodded nervously, covering her mic. Julian sat, listening as she finished the call. He asked her name, Sophia, and asked her to show him the logging system she used. She walked him through it, explaining glitches, the constant crashes, the scripts they were forced to follow that never matched real customer complaints. Julian took notes by hand on a yellow pad, not a tablet. When she finished, he said simply, "Thank you. You've taught me something today." The words were plain, but Sophia's eyes watered as though someone had handed her a medal. Words spread faster than gossip. The CEO had sat at a support desk, had written notes, had listened. For Julian, it was a first step, a clumsy but necessary one. Shame still gnawed him. Ara's cool gaze, Tiffany's shriek, his silence. But shame could rot a man or grow him, depending on what he did with it. He chose growth. He spent the rest of the morning walking halls he had never bothered with, shaking hands not for photo ops, but to ask, "What do you need?" Meanwhile, Ara moved with Arthur through the higher floors, meeting with division heads who had grown fat on complacency. She listened to reports, asked questions that sliced through jargon, and refused the easy answers. When a marketing director waxed on about consumer engagement metrics, Ara cut him short with, "That's all very well, but when was the last time you visited the lab?" The man blushed and admitted it had been years. Ara didn't scold him. She simply said, "Then tomorrow, I'll expect you down there with me." Her authority was not thunderous. It was matter-of-fact, which made it impossible to ignore. By midday, the building buzzed with a strange duality. Employees whispering about Julian sitting with support staff. Employees marveling at Ara dismantling executives with calm questions. For the first time in years, both names carried weight, but in different registers. Ara inspired awe. Julian provoked curiosity. That evening, while Ara reviewed financials with Arthur in the penthouse, Julian slipped into Aurelia, the restaurant where humiliation had stripped him bare. The maitre d' blinked in shock when Julian appeared, not in his usual polished ease, but with a somber set to his jaw. He asked for the manager, Mr. Dubois, who approached with the wariness of a man expecting complaint. Julian shook his hand firmly. I came to apologize. For the scene the other night, Tiffany's behavior, my silence. His voice carried no theatricality, only sincerity. Your staff deserved better. I should have spoken. I didn't. That's on me, Dubois. Startled, nodded. Julian pressed an envelope into his hands. Inside was a check large enough to make the restaurant's accountant blink, earmarked for distribution among the staff who had endured Tiffany's tantrum. Alongside it was a stack of handwritten notes, Julian's own words, not typed by an assistant, addressed to servers, bussers, line cooks, and dishwashers. Each note thanked them for their composure under fire. Word spread through Aurelia's kitchen like fire in dry grass. The CEO of Sterling Innovations had come back to apologize to the lowest on the ladder. Ara heard about it before midnight, Arthur relaying it with the faintest ghost of approval in his eyes. She did not smile, but her lips softened. Julian was trying. Trying mattered. Meanwhile, the outside world played its crueler games. Tiffany Davenport's name appeared in gossip columns by morning, her shriek at Aurelia described in catty paragraphs beneath photos of her leaving her apartment with dark glasses and a scowl. Headlines called it Valentino Gate. Socialites whispered that Julian had cut her loose. Friends who once hung on her every invitation suddenly had scheduling conflicts. Tiffany's kingdom of borrowed status crumbled quickly, as such kingdoms always do. Ara noticed the articles, skimmed them, and set them aside. Tiffany was no longer her concern. Inside Sterling Innovations, the tide turned. Engineers who had fled to competitors began to trickle back, curious about the rumors of Avance walking the halls. Shelved projects restarted. Prototypes long dismissed as impractical were dusted off and tested. The air carried less despair and more caffeine-fueled excitement. Even the janitorial staff whispered that the place felt different. Julian threw himself into the change with a kind of desperation that bordered on penance. He no longer swept through halls with perfumed confidence. He walked slowly, stopping to ask names, to memorize them, to repeat them days later. At first, employees thought it an act, but weeks passed, and his humility held. He was not reborn overnight. Old habits die slow, but he was shifting inch by inch. Ara noticed. She saw him arriving earlier, staying later, eating in the cafeteria rather than behind tinted glass. She saw him scribbling notes in margins instead of rehearsing speeches. And though she never praised him aloud, she allowed herself a private nod. He was learning. One night, long after most of the building had emptied, Ara and Julian found themselves the last two in the war room. A cavernous space lined with screens and littered with blueprints for a new security platform. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, the coffee pot hissed its last exhausted breath. Papers were spread across the table like a battlefield, equations and diagrams overlapping. Julian rubbed his temples, exhaustion heavy in his eyes. I used to think leadership was about never showing weakness. My father drilled that into me. Always be the strongest man in the room. Smile when you're bleeding. Shake hands like you're immortal. He sighed. It's taken me until now to realize strength isn't about pretending. It's about admitting when you failed and doing something about it. Ara looked at him across the scatter of blueprints. Her face softened, though her eyes stayed sharp. Admitting failure doesn't make you weak. Refusing to learn from it does. Their gazes held, a quiet current passing between them, neither romantic nor casual, but charged with mutual recognition. They were no longer the waitress and the careless CEO. They were partners standing on the same ground, different in style but bound by responsibility. The city outside glittered with its endless noise. Sirens, horns, laughter, lives colliding in millions of directions. Inside the sterile room, two people sat surrounded by papers and possibilities, both carrying scars, hers visible, his hidden, but both finally leaning into the weight of legacy not as a burden, but as a duty. Ara reached for a pen, circled a line on the blueprint, and said, "Let's fix what's broken." Julian nodded, his voice steady. Together. The hum of the lights, the faint smell of ink and cold coffee, the silence of a skyscraper at midnight. All of it wrapped around them like a vow. The autumn air outside Sterling Tower had shifted in the weeks since Ara Vance revealed herself. Manhattan still roared, as it always did. Horns, sirens, steam curling from manholes like the city was smoking a cheap cigar. But inside the tower, the rhythm had changed. Where once employees had shuffled through turnstiles, with eyes dulled by routine, now they arrived early, coffee in hand, with the glimmer of expectation. It wasn't joy exactly, it was something sturdier, something rarer in corporate halls. Belief. The board had tried to resume business as usual, but business as usual had been dismantled the moment Ara laid her scarred hands on the table and declared the company's soul wasn't for sale. R&D funds flowed again, and the labs that had gone silent like abandoned churches were alive with noise. Keyboards clacking, soldering irons hissing, voices raised not in complaint, but in debate. Even the janitors, who had once swept these floors with indifference, now felt the hum of purpose in the air. Ara walked those halls daily. She didn't glide like executives did, floating past with a perfume trail and a distracted nod. She walked as if every step mattered, heels clicking against marble with the certainty of a metronome. Her presence wasn't just noticed, it was counted on. She remembered names, asked questions, and, worst of all, for slackers, remembered answers. If she told you she'd check back on your project in 2 weeks, she did, and you had better be ready. Julian Sterling shadowed her sometimes, though never in her spotlight. His transformation had been gradual, but real. He no longer filled rooms with charm to hide his hollowness. Instead, he listened, sometimes awkwardly, often silently, but always intently. Employees began to look at him differently, not with awe, but with a kind of cautious respect. Respect was harder to win than admiration, but it lasted longer. Still, at night, when the building emptied and the city spread its neon veins below, Julian wrestled with shame. He saw again the restaurant, Tiffany's voice like broken glass, Ara's calm endurance, his own cowardly silence. But each time the memory stabbed, he used it as flint to spark resolve. He had learned to walk into departments he once ignored, to ask questions without pretending to know the answers, to admit fault without crumbling. Ara's shadow loomed large, but he chose not to flee from it. Instead, he used it as shade to grow into something different. The press eventually caught wind of the shift. Headlines called Ara the Phantom Shareholder, or the Heiress Engineer. Photographers stalked her, trying to catch her in some gilded setting, but the shots they got were always the same. Ara in navy suits, walking through glass doors, holding folders under her arm, her expression composed but unsmiling. The mystery only deepened. Journalists called her aloof, but employees whispered a different word, steady. Tiffany Davenport's name, meanwhile slid down the social pages like soap in a drain. Her shriek in Aurelia became meme fodder, her Valentino blouse a punchline. Friends peeled away, invitations evaporated, and her desperate attempts to claw back relevance only amplified her fall. The woman who once weaponized her beauty now discovered it had an expiration date without substance to back it. Ara never mentioned her again. Julian didn't either. The world had a way of dealing with Tiffany's without their help. But Sterling Innovations was not yet saved simply by optimism. Ara knew this. She demanded long nights in the war room, where whiteboards filled with sketches and equations, where coffee pots hissed and died only to be replaced. She leaned on Arthur Kensington for legal maneuvers, on engineers for innovation, on Julian for execution. Together they built a 5-year plan that was more manifesto than memo. Invest in research, honor the Vance legacy, rebuild not for quarters, but for decades. One evening, weeks into the grind, Ara and Julian stood in the R&D wing, watching a small team demonstrate a prototype, a biometric security device that unlocked with a glance faster and cleaner than anything on the market. The machine hummed softly, lights blinking like fireflies. When it worked, the engineers cheered, slapping each other's backs with the wild joy of children. Ara clapped once sharply, but her eyes betrayed satisfaction. Julian smiled openly, the first real smile in months. Later that night, as the building emptied, Julian found Ara in the rooftop garden, a rarely used space meant to impress clients with views of Central Park. The air smelled of damp earth and city smoke. She stood at the railing, hair shifting in the breeze. The skyline spread before her like a challenge. "You've changed the company," he said, quietly approaching. She didn't turn. "No, the people did. I just listened." Julian leaned beside her, hands gripping cold steel. "Maybe. But they listened to you because you carry your father's name." Ara finally turned, her gaze sharp. "Names open doors. Character decides what you do once you're inside." The words struck him harder than any rebuke. He nodded slowly, the city lights flickering in his eyes. "I failed that test once." "You're still being tested," she replied. Then her expression softened just enough to show it wasn't cruelty. "But you're doing better." For Julian, it was more precious than forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. Weeks bled into months. Projects restarted, patents filed, stock prices steadied. The board, once bloated with caution, now leaned forward when Ara spoke, nodding along as though hearing the echo of Robert Vance in her voice. Shareholders grumbled about dividends, but Ara's iron logic and Arthur's legal precision shut them down. Little by little, the company's spine straightened. Julian embraced his role not as savior, but as student. He carried coffee into labs, asked engineers to explain their work as if he were a freshman, scribbled notes furiously. Sometimes they laughed at his ignorance, but the laughter was warm, and slowly trust replaced suspicion. His humility became habit. The city outside kept roaring. Gossip rags found new scandals. Tiffany drifted into obscurity, and the world spun on. Inside Sterling Innovations, something sturdier than profit had taken root. Culture. Employees stayed late, not out of fear, but excitement. Janitors found engineers thanking them for their work. The cafeteria, once sterile as a hospital, buzzed with cross-department conversations. On a cold December night, Ara and Julian found themselves again in the war room, the table littered with blueprints, coffee cups, and crumbs from forgotten sandwiches. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the city glowed below. Arthur had left hours earlier. The two of them sat alone. Exhaustion heavy, but shared. Julian leaned back, rubbing his eyes. 6 months ago I thought this company was mine. Today I know it never was. Ara looked up from the blueprint, arching a brow. Then whose is it? He gestured vaguely toward the building around them. Theirs. The people downstairs. The ones soldering boards and answering phones. We're just custodians. Ara studied him for a long moment. In his words, she heard sincerity, not performance. For the first time, she saw not the careless man who had stood silent in Aurelia, but someone learning to carry weight. Then let's be good custodians, she said. They shared a rare silence that wasn't heavy with shame or expectation. It was simply peace. Outside, snow began to fall, soft against the glass, muting the city's noise for just a moment. Inside, two figures sat surrounded by papers and ambition, equal not by wealth or title, but by choice. The waitress with scarred hands. The CEO, who had once been hollow. Together, partners of necessity and conviction, preparing not just to save a company, but to build one worthy of their scars. And so it ended, not with champagne toasts or headlines, but with the steady scratch of Ara's pen circling a blueprint, Julian's quiet nod beside her, and the hum of a building alive again.